Okay, my name is Dick Miller. I retired from the Air Force in 1970, and I was a lieutenant colonel and a command pilot at that time. And my career in flying started out as a bombardier navigator in World War II, and I went to Korea in 1951 and 2, came back from Korea, and I went to a tanker squadron, KB-29 tanker squadron, where I was a radar observer, and then found out that pilot training had opened up, and that if you were in Korea, you could get an age waiver up till the age of 28 to go to pilot school. So I just happened to be 28, and I applied for the age waiver, so I was able to get into pilot school starting in 1954. So we went first to Marana Air Base in Arizona, and flew the Piper Cub for 25 hours, and then flew the T6, and then went to Williams Air Force Base in Chandler, Arizona, and flew the T-28 first, and then I get into the T-Bird, which is the subject of our documentary today. T-Bird, I guess I enjoyed flying more than any other aircraft I've ever flown. I flew it for about 15 years off and on, and at the end, totaling up the time and so forth, I had flown something like 11 or 1,200 flights in a T-Bird, and a tune of about 2,200 hours. So I really had a lot of experience in the T-33. Loved the airplane, it was simple to fly, and I said it was a sports car of the Air Force, and it always acted as such. What I brought in today was a model of the T-33. It was a single-engine jet, carried 2 passengers, or carried 2 people, usually 2 pilots, and the instructor could have been in the front seat or the back seat, and a student could have been in either seat too, depending on what you were doing training-wise. The aircraft itself had a jet engine in it, and weighed around 15,100 pounds, the aircraft weighed. The engine was a J-33, and the engine put out 4,600 pounds of thrust. So it was a fun airplane to fly. It was redlined, or maximum speed, at 0.75 Mach, which was about 375 knots at altitude. It was, as I say, a fun aircraft to fly. You could go about 1,200 nautical miles, 1,400 statute miles with it, and the flights lasted anywhere from hour and a half to 3 hours and a half. When I finished at Williams in the pilot training course there, I was a rated pilot, and went to Perrin Air Force Base in Sherman, Texas. I was very fortunate to go there because Perrin was the jet instrument and jet interceptor training base for Air Defense Command. So I started first, when I got there, went through the T-33 jet instrument program, which increased our abilities to fly instruments and jets, and then went to the F-86 interceptor program. This was the F-86D, or eventually the L model 86. So what was great about that is that they needed instructors, so they took our whole class and made us instructors. So we stayed at Perrin for 6 years, and in that length of time, I became very familiar with jet instrument flying, which is like life insurance if you're a pilot, and also flew the F-86 interceptor for 6 years also. As far as the instrument course is concerned, it was about 18 hours in the C-11 simulator, and then we went into the T-33, and we flew actually 13 missions in the T-33, where students were in the back seat, instructor up front, and we were able then to get 26 hours of jet instrument training in the aircraft. when you start flying a new aircraft in the Air Force, you're always given a pilot's handbook, which is what this book is here. And it's very, very detailed on how to fly the airplane. And it goes anywhere from a description of the aircraft to normal procedures, emergency procedures, operating limitations, flight characteristics, systems operation, and all that stuff. All of this stuff is expanded, and it's your study manual for the aircraft. It tells you everything you need to do about flying the T-33. In addition to that, you're also given a checklist. That's an abbreviated flight crew checklist for the T-bird, and that goes also into normal procedures, the same thing here. Emergency procedures, which are the red pages back here, eventually get to them. And then this actually not read in this one, it's the outline here where you show emergency procedures, which you had to learn by heart, by the way. And there's many pages of emergency procedures. In fact, 18 procedures where you had to learn by heart all the emergency procedures that could occur in the aircraft. And you can see here, it just keeps going and going and going. And then finally, you get to the end here, and the latter part of it is performance data. And this goes into things like fuel load versus aircraft gross weight, and takeoff and landing component, wind component chart, where you can figure out what your crosswind landing or crosswind takeoff component is. And your takeoff ground run distance, velocity during takeoff ground run, everything you really need to do operationally as far as the aircraft is concerned. I guess that the next thing we could do is to go out to the, I'd like to hit the engine first, the J33 engine, show you how that works, and then we can spend some time then at the aircraft itself. Here we are at an engine, a jet engine. This is comparable to the J33 engine that is in the T-33. In the front of the engine, you have accessories. Of course, the air is ducted in from an air duct in front of the engine, which we'll show about on the aircraft over there. These accessories are usually generators, inverters, whatever. They're here for a couple of reasons. They run off the engine, geared off the engine, and in fact too that it's in a cooling area. These things chances are run hot, like any generator would. So they're in the front cooling area. Okay. Well, the air comes rushing in from the intake duct into the compressor, and a centrifugal compressor means that the air, when it hits the blades, fan blades in there, is kicked to the outside, compressed, and then from the compressor goes into the burner cans. Okay. Now the burner cans are these cans right here. That's where the fire takes place. And by the way, the fire never touches the cans because of the air coming in is vented around so that the flame is in the center of the engine. Okay. So secondly, we got the air now being compressed from a compressor, and then it's ducted into the burner cans, and then the spark plugs fire. Very interestingly, normally a jet engine just has two spark plugs. And in this case, one's down here and one's on the other side in the opposite burner can. Okay, well, they'll fire, they start firing, and then we start putting the fuel in. Okay, that's when ignition takes place. Okay, then of course, the more the throttle runs forward, the more fuel you put in, the faster the compressor runs. And then of course, as the gases come off the burner cans, they hit a turbine wheel. That turns up very fast, and that's hooked to the compressor. The faster that goes, the faster the compressor goes, the faster the airplane goes. Okay, this is the tailpipe back here, and that's where the turbine wheel is. The turbine wheel is, in the T-bird, it's about yay big. It's got little veins on it. And the turbine wheel spins, of course, and as it spins, it runs the compressor, as I said before, which compresses more air into the engine. So, as I mentioned, an engine, jet engine, very simple. You have air, fire, and then you hit the fuel. ignites, you're on your way. So that's basically a jet engine, a J33, which is in the T33, which we'll hit next over there. Hits about 4,600 pounds of thrust. Newton's second law, equal and opposite reactions. When you start a jet engine, until the engine gets going, it really doesn't develop a lot of horsepower. In fact, you could have people standing in front of the wings and running full power, and that aircraft will not move on an early jet like the T-33. As it gets bigger, engines, of course, bigger, you can't hold them. But back then, you could almost hold that aircraft from moving because the engine doesn't develop that much thrust until it starts moving. I think now, after we have looked at the jet engine here, we can go over to the aircraft itself, and we can take a look at the aircraft, and we'll talk about the various components of it, my experiences in it, and so forth, and then we'll finish up. The actual T-33, I mentioned before, the T-33 is called a T-bird. It was called a shooting star first. The P-80, which was our first jet, was called a shooting star. When the Air Force was formed in 1947, separate entity, it became an F-80. And they made the F-80 was a good fighter aircraft. They used it in Korea, did very well over there. The Lockheed people that built the aircraft decided that there was a need for a trainer. The Air Force needed a trainer, and so they developed the T-33. T-33 is also called a shooting star, but what they did was extend the aircraft in length something like 38 inches. So that instead of a single cockpit, which you can see back there, they did the double cockpit, where they could have two people in it doing the various things that we'll talk about in a minute. But that's where the T-33 started. This happens to be the A model. They did later on, you can see this is a 58 version, which was one of the later models. The 58 version was called the -15, where they added a lot of little niceties, like they changed the navigation system from VOR ILS to a TACAN. TACAN was tactical air navigation, gave you the distance and the direction to any station that you could tune in. And they did things like preventing you from the trim running away. They could override the elevator trim and so forth, which had done me good, which something happened to me one day, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they did various things like that to make the -15 a little better aircraft, a little more expensive and so forth. But this one here is a 58, and it is a later model T-33. So what we'll look at first is the front end here. Start at the front and move backwards. The T-33 itself, the pitot tube, which is this. A pitot tube is used for your airspeed indications in the cockpit. They take the ram air through a mechanism that comes in here, the ram air, combine that with the ambient air in the cockpit to get a difference, and that difference actually is calibrated to determine your airspeed through the air. On this particular aircraft, the later model, they have a pitot tube here, and there'll be another one just like this on the other side. In the aircraft I flew, they had down underneath, there's a hole that's here. That's where the pitot tube used to be, down underneath. And eventually, I think they put it back up there because there were times when the aircraft landed, nose gear failed on the nose, and then wiped off the pitot tube plus parts of the aircraft down here. But anyway, they did make the change and put the pitot tubes on each side of the fuselage. These just house antennas for various different navigational equipment. This is a gun bay door. This is an air intake that cools something that's in back of here. But the gun bay doors can be opened by pressing the bottom, and this top comes out. We won't open it now, but there's 3 latches on the gun bay doors. Why I call them gun bay doors is back in the training days, they could put 2 .30 caliber machine guns in front of this. The ammo boxes were underneath the gun bay doors, and that's where the term came from. Well, when they took the guns out and took the ammo cans out and so forth, of course they had to leave the gun bay doors. They were part of the aircraft. So what it turned out to be was where there was no place to put your cross-country clothing, shoes and so forth. You couldn't put it under the gun bay doors. You had to use the travel pod, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we could hang clothes under the gun bay doors, so we could go across countries and take our clothes with us, which is pretty nice. Anyway, that's what the gun bay doors are. The big thing is, on your pre-flight, you always make sure that the gun bay doors are locked. If these things open in flight, they give you all kinds of goofy characteristics of flight, and the chances of crashing are pretty darn good. So anyway, that's what the gun bay doors are. Okay. This is the closes around the nose gear. I had an occasion where there's a lock that holds the nose gear down. This is just a tow bar, but the actual lock itself is here, and that broke off. Well, it happened about the worst place that could happen. I had taken a new instructor up, and I was giving him some back seat landings. The reason you checked him out in the back seat night and day was the fact that if you notice up in the canopy up here, the guy in the back seat can't see forward. The front headrest prevents him from seeing forward. So the only way you can land from the back seat is to look out the side windows. That's these smaller panes here, plexiglass panes. And what you had to do was to move your head periodically, make sure that you could see the runway on each side, where you could line up with the runway for landing. That's the only thing you could see from the back seat. As you get down lower, of course, you could pick up the ground itself and the runway itself and be able to round out and land the aircraft. But landing from the back seat, especially at night, was very interesting. But anyway, we had to teach instructors how to land both from the night and day from the back seat. Okay. What happened on the nose gear, we were coming back in after giving the pilot in the back seat, or the back seat rather, his required number of landings. We were down to about minimum fuel, which is about 60 gallons, out of 813, by the way. And we landed, and as we were, I was up front, and as I started to brake for the stop, the nose gear unsafe light came on, and the unsafe gear warning horn started blowing. Okay. So the only thing I could do then was to pour the coal to it, kept the nose gear off, took off, and called for a closed pattern, which meant you stick in close to the airport, so you use less fuel, obviously, because we were down to minimum fuel. So I tried to extend the gear extension, and we never got a safe indication on the nose, so we knew that something had happened down here. And after we landed and so forth, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but we found that the firemen that we'd called out, the crash rescue people, had found the downlock broken off and sitting out in the runway. So what essentially was this free swinging nose gear. It's not going to stay down when you land. So I took it, and I said the emergency gear extension procedure didn't work. So lined up for the final and came down in, and what you'd do if you had an unsafe nose gear, you'd attempt to touch down hard so that the nose gear extension itself would hitch forward and hopefully lock it down. Well, without a down lock there, it didn't lock down. So the only thing we could do was to just slow the aircraft down as much as possible and let finally the nose gear sunk down. Well, as luck would turn out, when the nose gear collapsed on landing, the nose gear twisted so that the gear doors were sitting on top of the gear itself, so the nose of the aircraft never touched the runway. The only thing it did was grind off the rim of the nose gear, and so we were really lucky. And they changed the nose gear strut, and the aircraft was in the air 12 hours of labor, and it was back in the air again. So we didn't get a well done, but we should have on that particular landing. But it was kind of thrilling at the time. If you can start back, I think, here just a little bit. These are the intake ducts where the air rushes into the engine, and there's one on each side, of course. A couple things here underneath. You see the gear doors on both sides. See, when the gear comes up, of course, then the doors close and the bottom of the aircraft is smooth. So before you hit the nose gear doors, these are speed brakes. Okay. Every single engine jet has speed brakes of one kind or another. Some extend from the bottom of the fuselage. 86 next door comes out of the back. The later models that we're flying now, the F-15s, 16s, they have a big door that opens up right in back of the cockpit. So, but they need something to slow down. Okay. Why do they need something to slow down? Well, if you put the gear down at a higher than gear lowering airspeed, the chances are that you're going to do damage to the gear. Not the gear itself, but it'll tear the doors off. Like if you landed a T-bird appreciably above the 195 knots, which is gear lowering speed, those outer segment doors would blow off, and you became very unpopular when you got back into the parking area, because the crew knew that they were going to have to change or add new nose gear door or outer segment doors. But these doors operate by hydraulic pressure. You have on your stick, the cockpit has a little thumb thing where or a little finger where you can pop the speed brakes down, pop the speed brakes up. And they're operated hydraulically, and all they're there for is to slow the airplane down. And as I mentioned, every jet aircraft is so sleek and so void of things that would bother the airflow. You got to do something to slow the airplane down to gear lowering speed. Example, T-33, we could be cruising anywhere at 260 knots indicated. That's 65 knots above gear lowering speed. So get the gear down, you're going to have to slow the aircraft down. You can't do it by bringing the throttle back, because the thing glides so well that it's never going to slow down. So you pop the speed brakes up. That's all they're there for, slow the airplane down. We'll talk about the travel pod back there. The cockpit itself, note the headrest in the front, headrest in the rear. Those are they're above the pilot's head. So if you had to eject through the canopy, if your system failed and you couldn't blow off the canopy, you could also smash through the canopy with the headset above the pilot's head. So that's the reason those headsets are up there. Okay. Also in the back here, as you'll notice, those little hooks that you see up and back there. There's several little hooks. Okay. What those are is they attach a bungee cord from the back to those, and on those bungee cords rides a hood for the back seat. So what there is a cloth hood that the guy in the back pushes forward, snaps down so he can't see out of the airplane. Well, that's the way you taught jet instruments. You put him back there so he couldn't see out, so he had to fly the instruments. So that's what a hood was for in the back seat of the aircraft. Also, quite interestingly, you can see it. There's a little mirror up there on the left of the cockpit. You see that where the canopy comes down, there's a little mirror. Well, we joked about the fact that if the guy in the back seat decides to lift up the canopy and cheat, or lift up the hood and cheat a little bit, well, there's a mirror up front where the instructor can see what's going on back there. So actually it was there to watch for aircraft coming from the back when you were flying. Well, it was a fighter, so they left the mirror up there. But that's what we used it for, to see if the guy in the back seat was cheating. And anyway, that's what the canopy looked like, and the hood looked where that went, where the headrests were used for. Ejecting from this aircraft, it was a ejection seat in it, and it was a powered seat with a cartridge that blew the seat out of the aircraft. And on each side of the seats, back and front, there were two handles, emergency handles, that when you were ready to eject, you pulled them up, and that blew the canopy off. It locked your shoulder harness to pull you back in the seat, and then you squeeze the triggers, and out you went. Well, ejection seats have improved over the years, and like the F4 is a zero altitude ejection system. This one here, the ideal situation was to be at around 2,000 feet with the nose up before you ejected, because it didn't shove you high enough above the aircraft like the ones do in the F4 where the chute opens. And this one here, they wanted to give you every advantage in the world, so you ejected at least 2,000 feet so you can get out of your seat, the chute would open before you hit the ground. The later models with the Martin Baker seats, they can eject off on the runway, and actually they go up high enough with a rocket seat for the chute to open and deploy and let them down. It's a real kick in the can when you hit the ejection seat. We had trainers. One primary, our basic at Williams Air Force Base was on a big track, and you sat in the seat and fired it off, and you got the feel of the ejection seat, what a kick in the can it was if you ejected from an aircraft. As far as ejection was concerned, if you were above 30,000 feet or so, you tended not to open your parachute. If you opened your parachute at higher altitudes, you were going so fast that it would rip out panels of your parachute. So what you did was delay the opening of the parachute. You wouldn't open it, pull the ripcord, but it would open up automatically at 14,000 feet. It was set with an aneroid in the parachute pack. So anyway, you would free fall until you reach a terminal velocity of 120 miles an hour, and the aneroid in your parachute pack would open it automatically at 14,000 feet. Also, one of the things you carried in front of your seat was a bailout bottle. If you ejected at higher altitude, of course, you'd be in rare air, it'd be hard to breathe, so you carried a bailout bottle. It's about this long, green bottle with a green apple on it. And before you ejected, you pulled the green apple, started the emergency oxygen flowing, so that you had oxygen as you were floating down in your parachute. Anyway, that's pretty much the ejection system. It's pretty foolproof, and they work very well. I mentioned before that the T-33 carried 813 gallons of fuel. Okay. They had a fuselage tank, which was up there right in back of the cockpit, just above the plenum doors. And that carried around 85 gallons of fuel. They also had the leading edge tanks, of which this is the cap. And I think this is kind of gummy, but anyway, these are leading edge tanks. everything. As we get older, it doesn't work as well. But anyway, the leading edge carried 104 gallons on each side. And the wing tanks, which this was the cap for, carried 154 gallons. So you had 104, 154 on each side, okay? Plus the fuselage tank with 80 gallons. Okay, the main fuel supply in the T-33 are the tip tanks. Okay. The tip tanks carried 230 gallons of fuel each for a total of 460 gallons. So you had 460 gallons in each of the tips, 154, 104, 80 gallons. Add that all up, it comes to 813 gallons. Okay. Anyway, these are the main fuel tanks in the T-33. One of the cautions on the T-Bird was you didn't do acrobatics until your tips were down to a minimum of 75 gallons. I like to burn them out myself because the fuel, which as you were going looping and rolling and so forth, the fuel would slosh back and forth and do funny things to the airplane. So you always wanted to burn the tips out before you did the acrobatics. You also, if possible, burn the tips out before you landed. If you had to land full fuel, you wanted to get rid of as much fuel as possible, so you wanted to at least run the tips out. Because when you landed with full fuel, it took a great amount of braking, and your brakes would be smoking by the time you got to the end of an 8,000-foot run. Anyway, that's the fuel system, and there's tips, leading edge, wing, fuselage tank. Okay, you're wondering what this little thing that was down there. Okay, it was called a travel pod, and what it was, very simply, if you were going on a cross country and you had to carry your clothes and shoes and so forth, that was a travel pod. It's like a traveling suitcase. They called it the travel pod. Of course, it was used for other purposes. If you went on a run to find a little liquor here and there, you could always store it in the travel pod, and or you could actually, under the right circumstances, make ice cream in a travel pod, and which has been done. Make the mixture up, put it in the pod, climb to altitude where it's minus 40 or 50 degrees, and it freezes the ice cream, and you have a nice pot of ice cream when you get it. Okay. This is the trim tab. Okay. What the trim tab does, you have a stick that has what they call a hat switch on the top of the stick, and you can trim the aircraft so it flies straight and level. You do that by activating the trim system on the rudder and on the wings and on the elevators. What it does is you're flying along and you look at the ball in the needle ball system, and if the ball is deflected one side or the other, you can actually lower a wing by hitting the trim tab switch to put it in a straight and level flight. Of course, you know that if you're descending, you can always, get diversion in an air show. C-17, by the way. You know if your aircraft is descending or climbing because you have an altimeter. So what you want to do, and you have a vertical velocity indicator, so to make sure that the aircraft is going straight and level, straight of course, you did take care of by way of the trim tab, and level by tabs on the elevators. Okay. So you can trim the aircraft so it flies straight and level. Okay. If the aircraft also, if you notice that the ball was deflected and you couldn't take care of it with trim, you had what they call a ground adjustable trim tab on the rudder. That's pretty primitive. And when you get back, you can see this is kind of wiggly. But when you back in, if you told the crew chief that the ball was deflected a little bit to the right, and you couldn't take it out with aileron trim, he could go out and get a pair of pliers and precisionally adjusting the rudder trim tab. It's called a ground adjustable trim tab. Pretty exotic for what it really was. Tailpipe. Normally that is loose because as the tailpipe heats up, it expands and has to have expansion room. Can't see. Normally, looking up the tailpipe, I don't know if the engine is in this one, but what you can see is a turbine wheel. Okay, the turbine wheel is activated by the hot gases coming off of the flame tubes, which he talked about with the jet engine over there. And the turbine wheel spins, of course, because the vanes deflect it and spins. And the turbine can spin. Jet turbines in the engines can spin up to as high as 13,000 RPM. This one here, I can't remember how much the turbine was spun in the T-bird, but you can look up it, and what you did on your pre-flight was look up the turbine wheel and make sure that all of the little vanes were all in place. Okay, they were called buckets. Okay, they were actually turbine blades, and sometimes through metal failure, one of those or two of them would break off, and you could see if they were broken off. And if they were broken off, you didn't fly the airplane, of course. You rode up the aircraft. Or, of course, the maintenance people have already seen this chances there. But one of the things you did was look up the tailpipe and make sure that all the buckets of the vanes were on the turbine wheel. White, red warning lights in the back. Another trim tab on this side. Get up on top of here. Can you see on that one where that door is open a little bit? Okay. A plenum chamber is where the air comes in and actually gets into the engine through the plenum here. And when the engine was running full tilt, there wasn't enough air coming in from the front, so those doors will automatically open from decreased air pressure, put more air into the engine. That's what the plenum chamber was for. Okay. Also, just above that, you can see a cover, cap. Okay, that was the fuselage tank. So what you did on your pre-flight was unfasten that Seuss fastener, open it up, make sure that the fuselage, you could make sure the fuselage tank cap was on and tightened down securely. Okay, you could also check the hydraulic cylinder up there too to make sure, hydraulic pressure rather, the hydraulic quantity, make sure that was full too. There's a couple of things you did as you walked around the aircraft and checked the plenum chamber and checked the hydraulic. Interestingly, in case you punch tips off, you also had navigation lights inside here. So they have here, you'll notice they're on the outside the tip tank itself. In case you punch the tips off, which you could do, you had navigation lights on the outside tips. Red left, green right. White light in the back. In all the flying I did, as I mentioned, I had about 1,100 or 1,200 flights in these. I was only able to punch the tips off once. Okay, I was out at the Walker Air Force Base out in New Mexico, and took off, and the oil pressure in the engine went to zero. Nothing. Okay. Well, the emergency procedure says go as fast as you can to the tip tank drop area, punch off the tips, land as soon as possible. Punch off the tips so that you don't make a heavyweight landing and have any problem with braking. Well, this was fine. It worked beautifully. Punched the button, went the tips. But the problem was that Walker Air Force Base had no spare tip tanks. So where it took me 2 flights to get out there from Illinois, it took me, I think, 4 flights to get back because I didn't have any tip tanks. All I had was internal fuel. So instead of having 813 gallons, I had 354 gallons, which wasn't enough to do a lot with. But anyway, you get up to altitude, you run out of fuel, have to land, refuel, up to altitude, refuel. I think I refueled 3 or 4 times getting back to the base that I was stationed at. But anyway, the tips went off fine, and let me see, anything else here? You can see the outer segment doors. By the way, these were what they call stall strips. Okay, what they were on there for was to give you a better indication of a stall in the aircraft. Okay. And it just disrupted airflow so that you got a stall indication before the stall warning came on. That's what these stall strips. Rescue. This had a lanyard in it where you could blow the canopy off if you wanted to get the pilots out. To get the pilots out, it's an emergency type thing. This was ejection seat warning that it did contain an ejection seat which was armed, possibly armed. And this was where you put the canopy open and close switch from outside. And it's the other pitot tube on this side. I mentioned the fact that there was one on both sides. And let me see, what else we have here? Hold off a minute. Things that happened to me in the T-33, which is out of the ordinary. In 2,200 hours, you can imagine there were a few things that happened that were something out of the ordinary. Remember I mentioned the blades of the buckets on the turbine wheel. I came back one day and there was 2 of those missing. You had a difficult time feeling that because it was spinning so fast and it was so well balanced normally that I didn't really know about it until I got back and looked up and there's 2 little pieces of the buckets gone off the turbine wheel. Let me see. I had also in a jet engine, the J33, it has 3 main bearings in the engine. It's down in the oil. And I had one of those quit on me, failed. So I had 2 more. This happened about 60 miles from the base. And the way I felt this was everything was running along smoothly. And all of a sudden, there's a little vibration. And it's really funny to mention, but you can feel the vibration in your backside when you're sitting in the seat. And I felt the vibration and I figured, well, I've got a bearing failure. Okay. The emergency procedure then was to leave the throttle where it was, as long as you had flying speed. Okay. I think I was back maybe about 80%, something like that, getting ready to descend into parent. And that's when it happened. Well, I left the throttle where it was. If you retarded the throttle or increased the throttle range, there's a good chance that bearing would seize and the engine would seize, and it wasn't a good situation. You lost your engine. Well, they said leave the throttle where it was until you got the landing made. So the procedure then was to descend back to Perrin, hit the what they call the high station, which was 5,500 feet altitude above the runway. Coming down the runway, you made your turn outbound, just as you normally would. You made your turn outbound, speed brakes out, get your gear down, flaps down, make your turn to final. And then, when you hit the field made, then you retarded the throttle to idle. Then if the engine seized, you were all over, you were getting in safely. So anyway, that was a procedure for being bearing failure. Another thing that happened in the T-33 was I went up, took off one day, and coming back in, the elevator trim motor fouled up on me, or the control. You could put down trim in the nose, but you couldn't get it out. Okay, well, rather dumb, but what you do, what I did was kick it a couple more flips and see if it would come back. Well, it didn't come back. All I did was make it more harder to keep the nose up. So anyway, the later model, like this one, this 58 model, had an elevated trim override switch where I could have overridden that, but back in the model I was flying, the 51 model, didn't have any trim override. So I ended up controlling the stick myself, which was decidedly a lot of pressure for the nose to go down because the trim ran away. And the guy in the back seat controlled the throttle, kept the airspeed where it was, and I flew the aircraft in, so it was a combination effort. He power, me flying the aircraft, and it worked out very fine. So nobody was killed. So I talked about losing the downlock, I talked about runaway trim, I talked about the turbine wheel problems. What else happened in this thing? Had a fuel control go one day where the fuel pressure started violently oscillating. So I had to go to the emergency fuel system. You had both the normal and emergency fuel system. And the only problem you had to do with the emergency fuel system was not to jockey the throttle too much because you could overtemp, but you had control of the engine, so back in and land, so there wasn't any problem there. The thing about the T-Bird, there was also always an emergency procedure, but just about any kind of a problem you can get into. It's a very honest airplane, and there wasn't anything that I ran into where I ever had to shut the engine down. And I had an apprehension about ejection anyways, so which was a good thing. As long as the airplane was running, I didn't see any need to leave it. I stayed with it, brought the aircraft back in, and as it turned out, it was fine for all the emergencies I had. Well, summing it all up, the T-Bird was a great airplane to fly, fun airplane to fly. We called it the sports car of the Air Force. We had thousands of them. In fact, at Perrin, where I flew out of for 6 years, we had 120 T-Birds. One of the good parts of it was back then you had plenty of fuel in the 50s, and if you wanted to go on a cross country, all you had to do was to sign up for an aircraft and take it off. You got the aircraft on Friday afternoon, and you didn't have to bring it back till Sunday night. So it was pretty nice. We got squadron. We got 3 T-Birds and 2 86s every weekend, called navigational proficiencies, which wasn't a bad idea. I flew everything locally, but it was good to get on a cross country periodically, go out and fly around and fly regular navigational procedures and so forth, go to different airfields and so forth. So, summing it all up, the T-33, I would say was I enjoyed flying the T-Bird as much as I flew any other aircraft, and it got so familiar after 6 years of flying it 6 years straight that it was almost like going out in the morning, getting in your car and turning the key on it and go. It was just that simple. We always used the checklist because you can always forget something, and usually what you forgot was a gear. And so anyway, checklist you used all the time, and never really had any problems with the T-33 that weren't correctable in flight, so it worked out really good. Other than that, that's about it for the T-33. Fine aircraft. They're pretty much all retired now. Steve Hinton over here at Chino has one that he uses at the Reno Air Races, where he's a starter with the higher powered, the unlimited jets, and his is pretty and flies it every year at the races plus other times. So there's a few of them still flying. I'm sure the Canadians have some, and but they are pretty much all retired. But I hated to see them go because they were such a tremendous aircraft.